Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you, Rachel. I loved your little helper Flynn this morning. He's
He
a
was too
ripper,
cool
isn't
for
he?
school, wasn't he?
I know. I
like
love
the
it.
last part was just well, we talked about hands in pockets. Like last part, we're hands in pockets.
Yes.
That's what's happening. Yeah.
Nah, he did.
It
He
was
did.
fantastic.
He did so
He
well.
had guts.
Well, it's so great to have all of you with us this morning, and I just thank you for joining us. I especially want to just thank everyone for the giving that's been sort of supporting Redgum. In the last couple of months, we've had to spend a lot more money on equipment. We bought 3 cameras, we've got lighting gear, and in April, that was our highest giving ever, and then May has even outdone that. And it's quite remarkable because, like, even this week, we had to get 3 new tripods, and they're really, really expensive. And to get good quality ones is really hard. And so there's a guy in Melbourne, Tom, and I think even this morning, Tom, you're watching us. I want to say a really big thank you. I know that you don't know us, but you gave us a really generous deal on the 3 tripods we got from you. And I just want to thank you for supporting what we're doing here, even though we're total strangers. So thank you, Tom. Last week was meant to be the last in this series of understanding the times and the seasons. But something's happening in our world. And a man called George Floyd died. But he didn't just die. We saw him die. We saw him walking. We saw him lying on the ground. And what we have seen is meant to change us. It's meant to have an impact on us. It's meant to have an effect. It's opened a wound in our world. And Australia is not America. But we do need to have a response to what is going on around us. And as far as Australia is concerned, we don't have clean hands. The racism in our country didn't just go away when Kevin Rudd said sorry. Last night I was speaking to a really special Asian friend of mine, and I was asking him about the racism that he feels in this country. And he said 40 years ago it was so blatant. But today it's still there for him, for his family. It's subtle, and it's sort of hidden in rudeness, in a condescending attitude of a sense of superiority to him, to his family. Now, you may have noticed this morning that I'm basically white, that I'm male. Well, technically, I was born a female. I suppose I've got to explain that, having said that, right? Back in those days, the fathers weren't allowed in the maternity ward for the birth. So my dad was at home. We got a phone call early in the morning to say that mum had had a healthy little baby girl. So Dad jumped on his motorbike and rode up to the hospital, and he walked into the ward where Mum was now. So I began life as Rosalie Edith Raymond, and Dad walked in and says, "We've got a little baby girl. We're going to call her Rosalie." And Mum says, "Well, actually, I thought he looked like a boy." So the nurses grabbed me, dragged me unceremoniously, had a little looky-see, and I'm a boy. So being white, being male, puts me in our Western culture in a privileged position, which is not right, but I can't change that. I have a voice, and today I want to use that voice. I can't speak on behalf of those that get treated differently in our communities because of their genetic background. I can't speak on their behalf because I've never known what that feels like, but Jesus does. And today I want to give Jesus a voice. I want to represent God's heart for humanity, for all of humanity, for those that don't have a voice except for an angry voice, a protesting voice. Australia is not America, but even in our own community here, we are quite unique in Victoria. Bairnsdale was the first high school, the first secondary college in the history of Victoria to have to put a police person in uniform on the school campus 5 days a week because of the racial violence. And I know this because that was the year that we started a lunchtime program in a secondary college called the Jam. And we managed to get $6,500 funding from Monash University to put towards this program because they thought that this might help the school. At the end of the 12 months, they'd done a survey before we began, and they did a survey at the end because they had an investment. Their money was in this. And they put in writing that we had changed the culture of that school in that first 12 months. The school principal actually asked me if we could run our Jam lunchtime program twice a week, because what was happening is the big Bark auditorium, we would just pack that with 400 or 500 kids every Wednesday, and then we'd have to close the doors. And the principal told me that the kids were going without lunch, that the school canteen had dropped to a third of its normal intake on a Wednesday so kids could be in this program. Now that was over 20 years ago, and racism in our community is still alive and well. But please don't assume you think you know where I'm going with this conversation we're having today. I want us to go on a little road trip together. I want to get to a place where we're going to meet someone you may not be familiar with, and I'm hoping that this person that we meet today will be helpful. But first, I want to give you a little bit about my background. I was born into a family where mum and dad loved all of God's creation equally. Never ever any difference in how mum and dad loved people. I grew up in a church where we sang songs like Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, all are precious in his sight. Jesus loves it. You get the idea, right? Now, I did that just to embarrass everyone else in the room here, right? I've got camera people cracking up in the background, so Chelsea, just try and control yourself. But at 5 years of age, I can remember going across to Nullarbor by train with my mum and dad and our family, and we went to an Aboriginal settlement, and mum and dad helped to build homes and accommodation. And I remember being on the back of a truck with all these Indigenous kids and swimming in a dirty, muddy river, and it was just an amazing experience. And as a young teenager growing up in Donald in a completely white Aussie world, there was one Chinaman lived on the edge of town, but that was it. And I just somehow secretly longed that I could have had an Aboriginal mate to grow up with. And when I was about 16, we did a trip around Australia. There's 4 of us, and we ended up our vehicle breaking down in Alice Springs that blew up the motor. And for 10 days, we stayed at the Fink River Mission in Alice Springs to repair this motor. And for 10 days, I had an Indigenous girlfriend called Daphne. So they said it wouldn't last, but 10 days, it was a great... Now, Daphne, if you happen to be out there watching this today, I just want to tell you that I haven't forgotten you, right? And so that's part of our story. And then when we shifted to Bairnsdale, when I was about 17 and a half, eventually we became part of what is now Riviera Church. And I played guitar and Coral played keys that very first Sunday. And as that church grew, there was a Koori family, Rhoda Muhammad, and her daughter Susan that were part of that church. And Susan became part of our youth group that we were running, and Charlie Campbell was helping us. He was a muso, great Koori guy. And suddenly we're involved in some Indigenous people's lives, and it was just beautiful. And then eventually when we started Solid Rock Youth in March of 92, when we began, Charlie was one of our youth leaders, and kids just started coming, all these kids from Bairnsdale and large numbers of them. And then eventually Charlie left and went to Sydney. And after he left, and I've joked with him about this, then all the Koori kids started coming. And over the 6.5 years of that youth group, there would be, say, roughly 100 kids on a Friday night. But all the Koori kids in Bairnsdale eventually were part of that youth ministry. They didn't all come on the one night, but we knew them all. That was their home. And I can remember a white girl saying to me one night, she said, "Lex, if you'd stopped the Koori kids coming, this youth group would be 2 or 3 times bigger." Now, whether that's true or not was irrelevant, because that's not our heart. That's not what we're going to do. I can remember we had a youth camp, and I had this sort of goal in my head to get 200 kids to this local youth group camp here in Bairnsdale at Coonawarra. I can remember the Friday night, and I counted, and we had 200 kids there in the auditorium. 40 were Koori kids. I had police even paying money out of their own pocket to help fund kids to come to this youth program that we'd put on. And I can remember that night that the guest speaker said to our senior pastor, "Boy, Lex must have had a rough life to be able to relate to all these kids." But that's not true. I'd actually had a sheltered life growing up. And then we shifted to Sydney, and eventually we planted a church of our own in the southwest area of Sydney. And when we began, we were just white Aussies starting off together. But by the time I left, our whole worship band, there wasn't a white Aussie to be seen. It was Samoan and Indian, and we had this beautiful Sri Lankan lady that we just all loved, Rupa. And I just so loved the mixed nationalities and races that were represented in Open House Church. I love the fact that even on a Friday night, combined with another church, we started an outreach to Indian people, and it was preached in Hindi and Tamil, and I can remember just before we left, these Indian people praying for me in their native language, and I felt so loved and valued by them. A couple of years ago, I got a phone call from Susan, the girl that was part of our youth group in the early days. I hadn't heard from her for 20 years. And she rang me and she said her mum, Rhoda, was in a coma in a hospital in Melbourne, and they were asking her to make a decision over her mum's life, to whether to turn off the life support or not. And Susan is ringing me, and she's asking, "Lex, what should I do?" And I just said to her, "Susan, you know what to do." And then she said something that caught me a little bit by surprise. She said, "Mum has always said that she wants you to take her funeral." And taking Rhoda's funeral was one of the most privileged moments in my life. I can remember driving down from Sydney, and it was here in Bairnsdale, and I can remember looking out on this, just a whole mob of dark-skinned faces, and I'm this little white boy at the front. And I said, "I've driven 8 hours to be here today, not for Rhoda because she's gone, but for you." And I could see faces of kids that were part of Solid Rock Youth. They're now adults and grown-up people, and it was just one of those really special moments in my life. And then earlier this year, I got asked to take Marinda King's funeral under very different circumstances. And what I've discovered is that there are no boundaries with the way we grieve, the way we hurt, the pain we feel, the losses. And God has designed that His grace and His love and His acceptance would also have no boundaries as it's expressed through us, His kids. That's part of my story. What will the story of Red Gum be? What will be your story? What will we look like in 2 years' time, in 5 years' time? Well, that starts now. That's determined now. Now. If the demographics of our community was so much percent white Aussie, so much percent Asian, so much percent Islander Australians, like whatever those percentages are, I don't believe that a church should just have that equally represented in its church community. I actually believe that minority groups should be overly represented in the life of a local church, because Jesus overly focused on minority groups, on the marginalised. Just think, when Jesus came back to life, he didn't present himself as the risen Jesus to the men in a male-dominated culture. It was to a woman, to Mary Magdalene, that he deliberately presented himself. And then he gave her the role to take this gospel that Jesus is risen from the dead, this good news, and take it to the men and preach it to the men in a male-dominated society. When you think about the story Jesus told of the Good Samaritan, the audience is expecting a Jew to be the hero. And Jesus twists it. And he takes a person that's racially hated, that's discriminated against, and he makes them the hero of the story. And then when Jesus and the boys are forced to take a shortcut through Samaria, there's a well that Jesus sits in when the boys go in to get some Maccas, and he's staying there. When they come back, they are lost for words. They do not know how to respond. They see him talking to a Samaritan, but not just a Samaritan, a woman, and not just a woman, a divorced woman, but not just divorced 5 times. And Jesus has been talking to her about her love life. In fact, he's even said to her that even the man you're with now is not your husband, it's someone else's husband. And I think what surprises me about that moment that's recorded in the Gospel of John is that John tells us that this is the moment when Jesus says, looking around in a Samaritan village, with Samaritans coming to hear what he has to share, he says to the disciples, open your eyes and look at the fields, they're ripe for harvest. He didn't say that in Israel. He said it in an area where there's racial discrimination. And he says it about a people, a minority group, that the disciples have been trained to hate. And Jesus turned it all around. And when Jesus launched his ministry, he read his job description out of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah. And it's a very narrow job description. And he focused on minority groups. And I want to read out what he said. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of the sight to the blind, to release the oppressed. That's people that are under the weight of racism. To proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. Here's the problem. Racism will be with us forever until Jesus returns. In fact, Jesus described that some of the signs of the last days, he said that there would be nation would rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And the word nation should be translated race. That race would rise against race. That ethnic groups would fight against each other. There would be conflict. Banning the 1939 period film Gone with the Wind, which they've just done, that's not going to help. That film that was set back in slavery, and slavery is depicted in it, won 8 Academy Awards. But one of those awards was for a black actress in that movie. Never before had an African American, especially a woman, been recognised with the excellence of her gift and craft and ability. But that happened in that movie. You can't legislate, you can't make laws that will create what our community, what our world desires. It's only Jesus that can actually change the human heart. On our farm, I have some Angora goats and we have some Boer goats. And the only difference between the two types of goats is what they look like. And in an area that they can choose whatever they want to do, the boar goats stay separate to the Angoras and vice versa. They do not mix together. In fact, my brother Jeff, who breeds chooks, he has gold lace Wyandottes and silver lace Wyandottes. They are exactly the same except for their colour. And you can raise two little chicks from the day they hatch together in a cage of two different colours, and then when you take them out and you put them back in a groups where they can choose where they want to go, they all go and mix with the birds of the same colour. When someone walks into the life of a church for the first time, or a social gathering, one of the questions we ask ourselves is there anyone here like me? It's human, it's natural to relate to people like us. But there's a bit of boar goat in all of us. There's a little bit of gold lace Wyandotte in us. And that's not racism. Racism is when we put a higher value on those that are like us compared to people that are different. Racism is when we treat people differently based on appearance, and that's when we're in strife. Women couldn't vote in this country till 1902. But in 1902, if you were a woman, you still couldn't vote if you were Aboriginal, if you were Islander, if you were African, if you were Asian, you still couldn't vote. It wasn't until 1962 that the Menzies government brought in the ability for Aboriginal people, First Nation people in their own land to be able to vote. And the reasons that that took so long are still woven into the fabric of our society. So where am I going with all this today? Well, remember I said we're going to go on a little road trip? And I want to introduce you to an old mate of mine. Some of you may know him as Ezekiel, a prophet that wrote a book in the Old Testament 2,500 years ago. But old mate Zeke has had a profound impact on my life, especially 12, 13 years ago. We had been invited to be part of a church plant in the southwest area of Sydney. And I can remember when we first sat down with the pastor of this church, my wife Coral says to him, "Do you have a problem with anger?" That was the wrong question. She should have asked him, "Do you lie about your problem with anger?" Because he was an abusive leader. He was a damaging leader. And in the end, we had to leave the church to maintain our integrity. And I can remember after we left, disappointed and confused by how someone could treat other people like that. I can remember sitting down and reading old mate Ezekiel's book. And I turned to chapter 34. And in this, it started to make me feel better because God is condemning bad church leadership. He's really getting stuck into them. And he even says these things. He says, "You have not strengthened the weak or healed the sick or bound up the injured." He says, "You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost." See, that's God's heart. But that was not what was happening in this church. It was the opposite. And then as I read this, it felt like it was getting better because now God's really saying what he's going to do. He says, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against the shepherds who and will hold them accountable." I'm thinking, yes, go God. And he says, "I'll remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves." And I'm loving this. This is music to my ears because I'm faced with this dilemma. Do I do nothing or do I report this pastor for his actions and his behaviour? And because I knew how he had financially borrowed money from people in the church and they were never going to get it back. I knew how he had lied. I knew how he had bullied and manipulated and yelled at people. And chapter 34 of Ezekiel, it comforted me. I could sit back because God's saying he will remove and he would fix it all. Because I knew in my heart I was innocent. I'd not been part of any of that, and Coral and I had walked away from it. And it felt good hearing Zeke's words. But then I made a mistake. A couple of nights later, I went back and read chapter 9 of Ezekiel, and I'd skipped over that. I'd never read that before. And this is where old mate really started to mess with me. It's a vision that he records, that he has. And in this vision, now remember, in a vision, it's not reality. So when you look at it, you've got to look at the principles in there, not just what's taking place, what's God saying, what's behind the vision. And in this vision, Zeke sees God bring judgment on his people Israel. And this is where he got me, because God is bringing punishment and judgment on people that have done nothing wrong. I remember when I was at primary school in grade 6, we had a teacher that had this thick leather strap called Horace. And it really, really hurt. And I remember one day in class, he goes, "Raymond, come out here." And I came out the front, he says, "Put out your hand." I held my hand out like this, and he goes, whack. And he goes, "That's for next time you're mucking around." And it just felt so wrong. And I think next time I still got it anyway, but it felt so unfair. And at first glance, God's response to his people Israel, it seems wrong. It seems unfair, but see, God's charge against his people is that they didn't grieve or lament the loss of innocent life, of the injustice that was in their city, what was going on in their land. He's not saying they were the cause of it. He's not saying that they were responsible. He's not saying they even did it. He's saying they didn't care. They didn't sigh or cry about what was going on. That they thought to themselves that God can't see, God's blind to this, and God doesn't care. And in this vision that Ezekiel talks about, he says that God's going to begin this judgment, this punishment in the temple first, in the church. That's where it's going to begin. God's going to put things right in the church first. And at the start of this vision, it begins with an angel dressed in linen that goes into the nation and puts a mark on the forehead of every single person that has lamented, that has aggrieved, that has emotionally been affected and cares about what's going wrong. It's the people that grieve and care for the loss of innocent life, of injustice, that God is going to protect. Now, that's quite different to just marching out of anger. It's easy and it's very human to protest and fight back against injustice that you personally felt, that has been generationally passed down, that you felt the pain of previous generations, that you're feeling the hurt on behalf of a family member, someone you love. But it's different to feel that emotion of grief and someone else's pain for someone that's different to you, that you don't fully understand their world, but you care about what's going on. And on that basis, God brought protection against people that may not have even done anything to change it. But see, God can work with a heart that is soft and emotionally caring for those that are hurting in their world around us. And it's not the first time that God's exposed this thought. 200 years earlier, in the book of Amos, Amos records this in chapter 6, and he writes this: "Woe to you who are complacent in Zion." And then he describes people just going back on with normal life, just getting back on doing normal stuff. And he says that the problem is you do not grieve over what's going on in Israel. And therefore, you're going to be the first to go into exile, that God would bring judgment because they're complacent about, not that they'd done it wrong, but they didn't care. See, for God, not having a racist bone in your body is not enough. It's not enough to be innocent when it comes to the injustice and violence in our world. I saw George Floyd die. I saw an interview with Carl Lentz and T.D. Jakes. I saw T.D. Jakes interview 6 church leaders and it touched me. It affected me. I saw a Australian cop take a 16, 17-year-old Indigenous kid that had been mouthing off and put his hands behind his back and leg sweep him and have his face go crushing into the ground. I saw that. It's changed me. In the last 2 weeks, something has changed inside of me. Emotionally, I'm engaged differently with what's going on than I was 2 weeks ago. But it's not enough to think that I'm not a racist, as if that's all that matters. When we are emotionally affected by what's going on, it's a good thing because we know that God's Spirit is alive and well within us. In fact, John, in 1 John, he talks about that we know we have been passed from death to life when we love our brother, when we care about those around us. And Ezekiel has showed me that I couldn't stay silent. I had to speak up, or I would be just as guilty as that pastor that was abusing people. So in this chapter 9, when I felt God speaking to me about you can't just be silent, I ended up writing a 2-page document and detailing what was going wrong in that church to the State Executive of New South Wales. And I risked being misunderstood, and I was. I was accused of being vindictive towards this pastor. And for 2 years, the State Executive did nothing. And then the weight of letters and evidence that was brought to them, eventually they called a public meeting in our community and they apologised and they took this pastor's credentials away from him. They shut the church down and they said that they'd never seen such bad behaviour. They didn't know how to process it. When we care, when we're not satisfied with just being innocent, when we speak up, it gives God something to work with, and it enables him to protect the ones that his heart is so passionate for, that he wants us to care about. Racism will never go away, but it can within 2 or 3 metres of you or I. When you're walking down the street, when you're in a shop, when you're deliberately looking for eye contact to get the attention of this other human being so you can say hi, you can give them a smile. Do you know what that feels like to someone that doesn't have that happen every day? It's precious, it's nourishing, it's counter-culture. It's God's way of doing things. And on Friday, I was at Simon's Cafe and I'd been there for a meeting. And as I was leaving, I was walking around and there's a little fenced area, an outdoor area. And there was 2 Koori women. There was probably a mum and a daughter having a little meal in the cafe there by themselves. And as I walked past, I sort of leaned over the fence and I said, gee, it must be nice being in the sun today. And they started talking about how good it was to be out of the home and being able to just go down the street and sit in a cafe. And as I went to walk away, she looked at me and she just said, thank you. I hesitated to tell you that because I didn't do that as a sermon illustration. I didn't do that because someone was watching. I did it because God's changed something in me. I don't think that 2 weeks ago I would have done that, but God's done something in me. It's not enough to be innocent. It's not enough to know that you're not racist. God wants us to care enough that we actually make a difference in our world. And that's my heart cry, that would be us, that Red Gum would be known as a people to do that to everyone in our community. Let's pray. God, I thank you that your heart is for all of humanity, but you have a special love for those that are marginalised. You said that the Spirit of God was upon you to bring healing, to set oppressed people free, for those that are in a prison of hatred and condemnation to come out, to those that can't see, that they'll be able to see again, that the year of your favour would be upon all of those that would respond to you, Lord. And I thank you that you've given us this ministry of reconciliation, you call it. It's a word that Paul wrote, and it's about all of humanity being reconciled together to be reconciled with God. And I thank you, Jesus, that this all begins when we relate to you and we allow you to change us. So my heart's cry is for us, that we would be willing to be changed by him.